Do you want to lift weights and do cardio? Discover the most important principles you should know to get strong and fit. Learn how to train like a hybrid athlete with our expert guest, Alec Blennis. For hybrid training, combining lifting weights and cardio, what are the most important principles to understand?
I think one of the most important things to understand when doing a hybrid program is avoiding the classic mistake of biting off more than you can chew and just trying to balance two full programs, like doing a full running program and a full lifting program and winding up super fatigued. So I think the most important principle is just doing a sustainable amount of work of both, not the amount of work you think you're supposed to be doing or that you found on this online marathon program plus bodybuilding program and just toss them together, but find something that you can actually stick to week after week after week and feel good about doing. And that might be a lot less than you think. Maybe you're only running 10, 15 miles a week instead of the 30 you found in your plan. But if you can do that week after week after week and you're recovering and you're progressing, then fantastic. So I think a lot of people, when they look at a hybrid program, they might think it's not very much of each thing. But when you add all that stress together, stress is stress. There's only so much time in the week, so much recovery that you can handle. So I think most people's starting point at least needs to be a lot lower than they might first suspect. And you can always build from there. Because people look at my program, right? They say, what is your training like? And I tell them, and it sounds like a ton, like that's crazy. I could never do. Like, well, don't start there. That would be dumb. But if you start, very, very small, maybe 50% of a normal program for cardio, 50% of a normal program for strength, as you build capacity, as you get used to it, ramp up. So I think that's the single most important principle. From there, we can talk about, how do you optimize, a training schedule? Where do you place certain workouts? What are your priorities and that sort of thing? But I think a lot of people get really caught up in the weeds there before they even are doing the right amount of work to be.
That's great. So just taking care of that major principle, and you can apply that to whatever exercises or form of cardio that you're doing. The main thing is just the amount of work. And would you throw in there the intensity as well? Does that become a factor?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, when they're a beginner with cardio, they have a tendency to push a little bit too hard too often. They don't see the value in true easy work, or they see easy work as really boring, especially if they come from a strength background where pretty much everything you do is at least a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 effort in the gym, or you're not going in the gym and doing RPE 3 to 5, right? But you might have a cardio session that's RPE 3 or 4. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people from a strength background to kind of get behind that idea. So they apply that strength mentality to their cardio, and then they wind up really fatigued.
What are the metrics of following a hybrid plan successfully? As in, if we are doing these principles, what would it look like if we're doing it well versus if we're maybe doing too much?
Sure. So some things that you want to look out for is really just tracking your performance over time. Do you see your performance declining? Are you getting weaker in the gym? That sort of thing. To make sure that you're on the right track, I wouldn't just start adding a ton of stuff into your program at once. I would start really small with what you're adding. So if you're already lifting, add just a small amount of cardio and then wait and observe and see how your lifts go. So say you're lifting 5 days a week and you want to start running, just add in 30 minutes a week. Try that for a week or two and then monitor what happens to your lifting performance. If it's going well, then maybe you try a little bit more and so on and so forth. But I think a mistake that people make is they're like, I want to start running, and they throw this giant program into the mix. And obviously things are going to go downhill from there. And then you're asking yourself, okay, what's fatigue? What am I going to adapt to? Where is everything going? And I think you've just made too many changes at once to get a lot of usable data out of it. So whenever I'm making changes to a program, especially a hybrid program, I try to change as little as possible once so that we can actually kind of test and see what did that change do? What was the effect of that change in the program? And then it gets pretty simple. If you're only changing 1 or 2 things at a time, you see what happens for the next week or two, and you know whether that change had the desired effect. But I think when in a hybrid program where there's so many moving parts, people will try to progress, 10 different workouts. They'll change 5 different things. They'll move around something in their schedule. And then, something goes well or doesn't go well. They're tired. They're like, I don't know what happened. Why am I tired? I'm like, well, I don't know either, because you just changed 12 things. So I would say if I could give one piece of advice to progressing a hybrid program, and then seeing if it's working, seeing if you're too fatigued, etc. Is just keep the changes really simple. Don't change too much at a time or it gets really complicated. It's already complicated enough. Don't make it harder than it needs to be.
That's the biggest takeaway I've gotten from a hybrid approach is you have less wiggle room for recovery. So it becomes even more important to be selective with what you do with your weight training and your cardio. If you're only doing one or the other, you've got more global recovery capacity. So you can get away with doing a bit more extra work or a few extra exercises. Whereas you hit the nail on the head there. Be really selective, do the most essential things, build that up over time, and you should be having trends in your progress. If done successfully, how many weeks can you ride that wave of linear progress, especially for someone that's like newer to hybrid training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on how you set up a program. My personal preference, kind of coming back to that simplicity and not wanting to have to change too many things, is I don't like the idea of kind of a really steep linear progression followed by a deload and then another steep linear progression. I like to find a program that someone can consistently stick to and execute at a high level for a fairly long period of time. Maybe they're running it for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, maybe even longer than that, without having to make a ton of changes. I would rather see you get 1% better over a month, 3 or 4 months in a row, than make a 5-10% jump for 1, 2, or 3 weeks and then be like totally worn out. And then you start over and then you're backing off again. And then you actually get fitter. Sure. But if we can see that consistent, just like 1-2% gain month over month for a few months in a row, then I know you got better. So I prefer that sort of approach. When you zoom out and think, what kind of progress is realistic to make over the course of a year, for example, obviously it depends on your training level. But I know for me personally, like if you told me, hey, you're going to add 20 pounds to your squat this year, I'd be thrilled. I'd be like, that's great. I'd love to add 20 pounds to my squat. You know what I mean? So if I kind of think about what does that look like on a month over month basis, if I'm adding 2 pounds to my squat in a month, that's pretty good. So I try to break it down into chunks and think what kind of progress is actually realistic over a week to week basis, and not try to force anything that is, an entire order of magnitude beyond that. I don't need to be adding 10 pounds to my squat in 1 week if I'd be happy with 20-pound gain over a year.
Love it. And just a personal story with the hybrid training, combining lifting weights, calisthenics, and cardio. I've started introducing cardio this last 6 weeks, and I'm glad that I have your tick of approval. I haven't gone too hard too soon with the amount of training intensity and volume of cardio. I'm just doing 2 times 20-minute zone 2, just jogging, and including that into my program to see the impact it has, because I found that when I'm doing higher rep sets in the gym, I get gassed out. The limiting factor, if I'm honest with you, has become my cardiorespiratory fitness. And it's crazy, even after this last 6 weeks of just doing 40 minutes, I'm much better able to tolerate my 20 rep Bulgarian split squats without absolutely dying from a cardio perspective. So if you're someone who's like, what's this, combining weights and cardio, what's the point? I just want to get strong and muscular. There's your answer. And it's had a profound benefit for me personally.
It does make a huge difference in recovery. And when people hear the word recovery, they think of, you do a hard workout, you get sore, and 2-3 days later you feel better, you're ready to train again. They think of that recovery. And I think that having some good aerobic capacity can certainly have a meaningful impact there. But I think even more important for a lot of people is the recovery when you're actually in the gym, especially if you're training on a limited set of time. Like you're a normal person, you got to get to work. Maybe you got to get in and out of the gym in 60 minutes. If you can cut your rest time down to 2 minutes between heavy sets of split squats instead of 3, and then you compound that over the course of a session, maybe you're able to get in 20% more effective training volume session after session after session. And thinking about what that can do for your long-term progress, big picture recovery aside, just being able to get in more quality volume in a finite period of time is a huge benefit to being a hybrid athlete. People think I don't have time for cardio, but I think a lot of the time that you invest in cardio gets paid back to you in the form of those kind of recovery dividends.
That was very well said. Now, for people that are excited and want to start doing cardio, what would you say is the minimum effective volume and intensity to get the benefits?
Sure, great questions. First, I'll say there's no specific like rule of thumb for start doing this type of cardio, like only do easy cardio, only do hard cardio. I think even if you're a beginner, you can do a wide range of cardio. You can do intervals, you can do steady state, you can do all of the things. Just find an appropriate starting point for you within each of those categories. In terms of minimum effective intensity, we're generally looking at about 50% of your heart rate reserve. Heart rate reserve is, well, we'll go percentage of max heart rate, probably a little simpler. 50 to 55% of your maximum heart rate is a good like minimum to try to hit. If you're below that, it's not that it's a waste of time, but if you're on an easy walk and your heart rate is, only at 95 beats per minute, you're probably not getting a good cardiovascular stimulus. You're getting good, healthy physical activity, but probably not doing much to move the needle forward. So getting at least to that 50, 55% is a good rule of thumb for most beginners, and probably minimum of more like 60 to 65% for a more advanced cardio athlete in terms of just minimum effective dose from an intensity perspective. In terms of total volume, assuming you're hitting that minimum intensity, 60 to 90 minutes per week of that kind of easy zone 2 training is going to be enough to get the majority of the health. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of like the World Health Organization physical activity guidelines, that 60 to 90 minutes per week of physical activity or moderate intensity physical activity, or what we call easy intensity endurance training, that gets you the vast majority of the kind of longevity benefit in terms of hazard reduction or mortality reduction. That being said, there doesn't appear to be an upper limit or upper bounds to the benefits. So you can certainly do more, continue more benefits. And even at the elite level, we see that elite cardiovascular athletes have even lower disease and mortality rates than sub-elite. So you can keep pushing that essentially as high as you want. But honestly, that first 1 to 2 hours in a week that you do is by far the most impactful. When we look at kind of the slope in terms of mortality reduction, there's a huge drop-off in risk just from doing 1 or 2 hours of cardio, and then it really starts to kind of level off. So if you're thinking, I don't have a lot of time to commit, I can't bite off, these 10-hour training weeks a lot of endurance athletes are putting in, don't feel bad. Just as little as 1 or 2 hours can be extremely, extremely powerful.
How about for the people that have been doing hybrid training for some time? What is the kind of upper threshold of doing cardio if your main objective is biased towards lifting weights?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think it heavily depends on the intensity and the modality. I've seen cyclists, for example, and swimmers, people doing kind of low impact stuff, accumulate some absolutely nasty training volumes while still kind of making progress in the gym, putting on size, that sort of thing. That repeated eccentric loading or impact stress from running, downhill running, that kind of stuff, can certainly wear on you a little more in terms of ability to get some productive lower body sessions in. So I think that does get a little bit trickier. Depends a little bit on body weight, how experienced you are with running. Are you running on trails? Are you running uphill, running downhill, etc.? But I would say when it comes to low impact stuff, as long as you are eating enough food to support the caloric expenditure, and as long as you're not ramping up too quickly, irresponsibly and going from 3 hours to 10 hours overnight, if you're gradually building that up over time and only doing the volume that's necessary to move the needle forward for your fitness level, I wouldn't say there's an obvious upper limit. If you can keep eating enough food and if you still have enough energy and time to get to the gym, I think it's kind of a non-issue. The food can be tricky, don't get me wrong. When it comes to running, I hate throwing out hard numbers, but I do see, somewhere in that 40 to 60 mile per week range. I haven't seen a lot of runners make it past that amount while still continuing to have a lot of size or strength. Not saying it's impossible. I'm sure there's someone out there that's done it. But I do see that as kind of like a fuzzy threshold that has been tough for a lot of people to cross.
Thanks for clarifying that. I understand, given the complexities of the variables of running as you've just listed or whatever cardio you're doing, it depends is the ultimate answer in fitness.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you still offering a guideline and some takeaways for people to maybe work towards if they've got that ambition.
Yeah, for sure. And the tricky thing with mileage, and mileage is always, it's a huge, it depends sort of thing, because those variables, like I said, body mass, running experience, running terrain, everyone's tolerance for mileage is so different. Even beginner runners, I've seen, especially hybrid athletes, like bigger, heavier, like male physique athletes that are upwards of 200 pounds or maybe 100 kilos. I've seen guys like that struggle to get to the like 10 mile per week range. And it's a process to kind of get them even just to 10 miles a week. Where on the flip side, I've had some like lighter, smaller female physique athletes, for example, they're half the size of some of these giant guys. And I've seen them ramp up really quickly. I'm training a woman right now for Leadville, and she's a pretty new runner. She's only been running for a year and a half. And she ran 100K a couple months ago. She's already up at like 40, 50 miles a week. And for a new runner that's only like 2 years into the journey, that's absolutely phenomenal. And I don't think you can see a lot of like 200 plus pound men making that same kind of volume progress.
Maintenance is something that we don't often speak about enough in fitness. It's always about progressive overload, obviously for the right reasons. But why is maintenance so important for the hybrid athlete?
Sure. I think maintenance is, and it's an important concept for everyone because you're always able to put in the work that's necessary to improve everything. Even if you are just training in the gym, maybe you don't have all the time you need in a week to make progress on the legs and core and arms and do like neck accessories and forearm training. And there's just so many things, right? So you might put some of those on the back burner and just maintain them and say, I'm going to really focus on my legs for this few months. That's even a bigger consideration for the hybrid athlete as even more stuff they got to work on. So you might be a hybrid athlete who, to move the needle forward on endurance training, it might take you 8 hours a week of training. Same thing on the strength front. To move the needle forward, you might need to spend 5-6 hours in the gym. If you only have 8 hours total, you can't do both. It's just not going to work for you. But you could potentially bring one back to, 30%. Maybe you just do 3 or 4 hours of cardio to maintain and you focus on that gym progress, or vice versa. So for a lot of, hybrid athletes that have practical considerations and constraints in terms of their time and energy commitment, being able to maintain a few things and then progress others is really important. You can do that on the scale of strength and cardio, maintain one, progress the other. You can also do it kind of within each discipline, like we talked about, maintain upper body, progress lower body, maintain volume or aerobic capacity and progress speed, or vice versa. So being able to pick and choose and not feel like you have to do everything all the time.
Maintenance is one of those things it's not sexy to talk about because it's not synonymous with making progress. Whereas that's just what is pervasive in the fitness culture. It's always more is better, go hard, train insane or remain the same type of concept. But that's one of the factors that I see as separating intermediates from more advanced people. The understanding that you can't just keep adding on work across the board. And you put it so perfectly with maybe your lower body's weaker or doesn't have as much size. So you maintain upper and put more of your resources towards lower body. And that's just something that will separate people from who they are currently to perhaps who they want to become, just having that maintenance mindset.
I think it gets more and more important the more advanced you get, when you think of what is your minimum effective dose. I think if you're say you're a brand new athlete that's never worked out before and you want to start down this hybrid athlete journey, the dose of cardio it takes to get better is so low, and the dose of strength it takes to get better is so low. And you think about all these minimum effective doses for all the different fitness qualities, it's all so low. So I encourage people who are more novice, don't over specialize too soon. Do it all while you can. So if you are pretty new to the game, do speed work, do long runs, do mobility training, do strength training, do all the things and capitalize on the fact that you can get better at all those things at once. And the better and better you get, you might have to start making some of those choices and saying, I'm going to put this one on the back burner. But especially for, I think, the most common kind of archetype of hybrid athlete that I've encountered at least is the strength athlete who's newer to cardio. When you are newer to cardio, the minimum effective dose is fairly low. and you don't have a lot of exposure to the different intensities. You probably haven't done a lot of true sprint work, tempo work, low intensity, steady state. So don't pigeonhole yourself thinking that you can only do one of those things. Just do a little bit of all of them, and I promise you'll get better at all of them. And then once you get a little more advanced at cardio, then you might start having those conversations with yourself of, okay, am I going to focus more on intensity or volume this block, those sorts of things. But I would say for most people new to cardio, try to distribute your resources pretty evenly across that full intensity spectrum.
And just using myself as the example again, 40 minutes, I'm getting success with it. I'm not destroyed by it. It feels a lot easier in terms of intensity and volume, and I'm getting the benefits. What I'm trying to tell people is there's no need to do your maximum recoverable volume for cardio if you've only been doing it for 6 weeks like myself. So just play the long game, have fun with it, see the benefits, because there'll be plenty of time to warrant more volume and intensity later.
Exactly. And for someone like you who maybe you'll add some speed work or higher intensity stuff down the road, I think a temptation is to say, okay, I'm ready for speed work now. I'm going to do 10 by 400. And it's like, no, you haven't been doing any speed work. Maybe just do a couple, strides or hill sprints, do a couple of those at the end of a run, or maybe do a fast finish run or 2 by 400, just put in a little speed work and see how you respond. You don't have to go, full send, like full speed workout out of the gate. Take advantage of the fact that you don't have to do that odd, because maybe when you're still running next year, maybe you do have to do a 10 by 400 workout. Save it for when you need it.
The devil on my shoulder is telling me, Daniel, do tons. There's so much there. And then the angel on the other side is like, Alec, just chill, take your time with it. You'll get there in the end.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a quote, overtraining is simply under recovery. What is the misconception people get about recovery?
So much. I feel like with the, multi-billion-dollar recovery industry feeds us a lot of bad information and confuses people. I think that it sends the message that you can do more to improve recovery than is probably realistic. I think that what we can do to improve recovery is really just get out of not saying there's nothing we can do, but I think that there's a lot more we can do to slow down recovery than to speed. If we are properly fueled, if we're properly rested, if our stress is low, if we have a environment that's conducive to healing, if we're healthy, if we have a strong immune system, if we have a strong aerobic system, that is the foundation of good recovery. And then you just need time. In terms of, anything special that you can do, there's not a lot of good evidence to any of the things. And not that they're bad things. I have nothing against feeling good, doing kind of feel good modalities. But your massage, your foam rolling, your, even stretching, and not to say there's not benefits to stretching, but in terms of just a recovery standpoint, are you ready to train hard again? Most of these things are just not going to move the needle very much. They're just going to keep you busy while time runs its course and your body does what it's going to do. What I hate to see is people look at recovery modalities and they turn something that's supposed to be recovery and they make it just yet another stress. So like I got to set aside my 20 minutes for this, and I got to do my massage, and I didn't get the ice bath today, so I'm ruined. And these things that are supposed to be helpful are now harmful and stressful, and that they're probably not doing a whole lot to begin with. So don't let those things come at the expense of those foundations: your overall health, your mental health, your immune health, your aerobic capacity. Those things are extremely important, and I think all of those things on an individual level, we never cease to underestimate them. On the mental health side, for example, I think one of the best things you can do to facilitate recovery is go out and have some fun. Like just kick back, relax, have a good time. Anything that's going to get that stress down, chronic inflammation down. Socializing is super great for that. And I think if someone's like, hey, what do you recommend for recovery? And I say, hang out with your friends. They're like, what are you talking about? I don't have friends. I'm an athlete. I just train all the time. But I think that kind of stuff is super, super important. And people always want to look for those things like what gadget should I buy? What supplement should I buy? And again, not that those things are completely useless, but they're just a drop in the bucket compared to those things I mentioned before.
The way I see it, and I agree, is these products or services are implements that are used to make money, essentially, at the end of the day. Like everyone that's in the health profession that offers massage understands what matters most: the sleep, the recovery, the nutrition, the decreasing stress, as you've just said. And it's unfortunate how these recovery methods are promoted to do more than they actually do. And that's a frustrating piece. And it takes an external locus of control almost, that, oh, I need someone to massage me, or I need this tool to make myself good. And I remember reading from one of your posts that this can often be hazardous from the perspective of, yeah, sure, the massage might make you feel better, but that can temporarily masquerade the true fatigue that you're actually experiencing. And this could lead to further overreaching, potentially increase your injury risk, because you're masquerading the actual symptoms that you're feeling.
I think most people who are fairly well versed in the fitness industry know that it's probably not a good idea to cover up your pain and soreness with a bunch of anti-inflammatories. You know, you don't work out hard and then go pop 3 Tylenol and be like, oh, I feel good on the train again. We know that those sorts of things can even potentially blunt the adaptation from training. So you want to stay away from that kind of stuff. And not to draw a false equivalency, I don't think that a massage is exactly like popping Tylenol, but I think that is a little bit of a slippery slope in terms of, you know, I got a hard workout tomorrow, I'm sore, I'm going to go get a massage or whatever. That doesn't make you ready to train any sooner. You might feel better, but that doesn't mean you're actually ready to perform. If you have to perform, I think where it can be valuable is if you're an in-season athlete, for example, and you're beat up from a game and you got to turn around and play again tomorrow, do what you got to do to feel, you know, if that gets you to the starting line of that, you know, whatever it is, feeling better, then by all means go for it. In terms of like a long-term progression and training response, there's no need to force yourself back into the gym sooner than you would otherwise feel ready to do.
Off the back of this, bad fitness advice is everywhere online. What are the red flags that we should look out for?
It really is everywhere. Unfortunately, you know, bad information spreads faster than good information. And not to say there's not great creators out there that have a strong following or get tens of thousands of likes. You know, it can absolutely be done. But I think when you look at someone and you see, you know, that they have millions of followers, or you see 10,000 plus likes, I think there's a natural inclination to let that kind of make you trust them automatically or implicitly. And you're like, oh, this person has credibility because they have a following. I would say that's not a reason to trust. It's a reason to dig a little bit deeper and be skeptical. It doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong. Again, there's lots of great, massive creators out there. But when you see that kind of following, think, okay, how did they get here by spreading half-truths and misinformation and clickbait stuff? And is that why they have the following? Or do they have a following because they think I'm good on this content? So just going into it with that level of skepticism, I think is important, and not implicitly trusting anybody on the internet just because of their following, their credentials, the athletes they train. You know, we see PhDs promoting all sorts of quackery all the time. We see people training, you know, NFL and NBA players promoting all sorts of quackery all the time.
Movie stars, they're the best ones.
Because unfortunately, a lot of this industry it's less about what you know and about who you know. So a lot of times people will get into these positions based on, you know, personal contacts, relationships, and those sorts of things, not because they are actually the best coach in the world or that sort of thing. And I think the average person engaging with these people sees someone working with a celebrity or pro athlete or with a PhD, and they're like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. So I would just caution people not to read into some of those things too much, just kind of knowing how those sorts of relationships are formed in the first place. But then once you're actually looking at the content and thinking, okay, how do I determine if this is good or bad? One, never believe something just because you saw it once. Look for multiple people to iterate the same idea, see who else is saying this, who else is agreeing with this, what are the critics saying? You know, just look at both sides. Don't see what one person said and then go start telling all your friends about it. Just forget it and see if you see the same thing again or again. And be sure to pay attention to what some of the critics are saying too, because even for some of the content that I put out, I put out a lot of content about being anti-fragile, kind of movement optimism, that sort of thing. And I encourage people, go look at what some of the other people are saying and compare and contrast. I don't want to only provide one side of the argument. So I think a willingness to engage with and talk about the other side and being willing to kind of steel man your own argument and not, pretend to be infallible is important. And you can see that a lot in the comments. One, are the comments on a post, is it just an echo chamber where they've deleted and blocked everyone that disagrees with them? Can you find anyone actually trying to have a debate? Usually I'll have at least a handful of people that disagree with me in a comment thread. And I think that's important. I think it's important to keep it there and to talk respectfully with these people. If you consistently see someone post something that is potentially controversial and makes your head, you scratch your head a little bit, but then you look at the comments and it's just a bunch of fire emojis and thumbs up, you're like, what are they hiding? What are they blocking? And then if there are comments that are disagreeing with them, how do they respond to it? Do they respond with a willingness to engage in a civil discussion, or do they resort to ad hominem personal attacks, or appeal to authority saying, read this book I wrote, I have a PhD, I'm stronger than you, those sorts of things? Do they actually engage and focus on the topic itself? So those are some simple things to look out for. Don't trust people just because of their credentials that they're following. Be willing to look at multiple sources of information and see how people respond to that kind of, to that sort of threat.
That was a great summary. And the reason the follower count is a simple heuristic, it's that social proof. We search something that suits our fitness objectives, and the main person speaking about it, surely everyone sees them as the trusted source. But looking a bit deeper, it's more the language I look for in how someone communicates their fitness principles. And whenever someone can see both sides of a coin, so to speak, the pros and cons, and discuss the context and certain benefits, as opposed to just do it like this, the former is the person that I would trust, and the latter I would look at as being potentially disingenuous if they have the scientific knowledge to understand better, or otherwise just being nefarious to try and get more followers. So looking for people that fit that mold is what I would personally be looking for.
The people have a poor understanding, and they think that you have to dumb things down too much. I think sometimes we don't respect our audience enough, and we are like, oh, I'm making content for 50,000 people or 100,000 people. I got to dumb it down to like third grade level. And I would disagree with that so much. I'm like, people aren't dumb. You have to get their attention, but they're not dumb. You can have a nuanced discussion and get people to engage with it. It's challenging. And I think that is the challenge of social media, is how do you do once? How do you get someone's attention, but then still actually provide value versus getting their attention with just some sort of, clickbaity, controversial topic and not really educate them. But I think it can absolutely be done. And people think it's a choice of, do I entertain or do I provide value? And I don't think it's an either or question.
No. And you tend to get people that either overcomplicate, use too much science and jargon when it's absolutely unnecessary, or people that dumb it down so much. And the art of the creator, and what I personally enjoy with producing fitness content, is that ability to distill down the information into its most important and understandable pieces and then elaborate. If the creator isn't able to do that, I feel that that's a deficit in giving people the full picture, or at least allowing them to get further insights and question further the topic that they're searching.
Whenever I start writing a post, it usually starts out much longer, and I think how can I consolidate this into less, and how can I consolidate this into less? But eventually there becomes a point where I don't think I could consolidate this any further without losing some important bits of information. And I think that's a good guide of consolidate it as much as you can, but not more than that. If I posted the full version, I don't think anyone would read it. It'd be too much. But if then you over consolidate and oversimplify, then you're just kind of another person throwing out the same information that's already been repeated 10,000 times.
Now, switching gears, with unilateral training, doing single arm or single leg biased movements, what are the biggest misconceptions from mainstream fitness?
Oh, it's a good question. I think a lot of nuance in unilateral training, because people just kind of think of these two black and white categories, bilateral versus unilateral. But I think the pros and cons to each are really context dependent. So, if I look at like a single leg deadlift and I think what are the pros and cons to that as opposed to a bilateral deadlift, that's a whole different conversation than like a single leg versus a bilateral leg extension. You know what I mean? So depending on the exercise, some of the things to talk about with unilateral versus bilateral are totally different. And I think that oversimplification of unilateral training is part of the problem. And people will say things like unilateral training is inherently safer, it's more functional, or kind of better represents real world scenarios. They'll talk about the bilateral force deficit and argue that you can get more load when just doing one limb at a time. But all of those sorts of things are really dependent on the specific exercise. And sometimes those ideas hold a little bit more truth and sometimes much less so. So I think with any exercise, we really got to focus on look at the exercise holistically, if you will, and not just say, oh, it's a unilateral exercise, it's safer, more functional, and you're going to get more load or something like that. It really depends on the exercise itself. On the topic of safety, I think that a lot of people think that unilateral training is safer or less load on the spine in particular. A lot of people will talk negatively about, say, like a traditional back squat or a deadlift and say, spare the back, don't put all that axial load on your system when you could just train the legs independent and that sort of thing. And I think that's not the best line of thinking for a number of reasons. One, if you're really good at unilateral work, I've seen people get their lunges or their split squat up to 75-80% of their back squat even. So the axial loading in unilateral work can still be really quite high, especially when you consider the fact you have to do it twice. So then you're getting double that volume at also a very, very heavy load. So I don't think that argument holds a lot of water unless you're just severely underloading the work in general. If you're just doing single leg deadlifts with 35-pound kettlebells, sure, but then you're also just not going to get stimulus in general. So I think if you stick with it, if you get strong, if you practice these things, if you're doing quite a bit of volume, you're training both legs, I don't think that the axial loading and spare the back argument holds a ton of water. And the reality is you want that part of your body to be strong too. You just want to do the right amount. So I'll sometimes say things like, I'm going to save the back and I'm going to do the single leg deadlift, but it's not because I don't do regular deadlifts too. I just might be at my limit in terms of how much more fatigue I can take from that movement. So it's not a spare the back, don't do deadlifts, but it could be let's limit the amount of that sort of specific fatigue we have in the program, but still using bilateral and unilateral training too. So I think that's kind of a big picture myth and misconception about unilateral training, is that you're doing it to spare the back overall, but really just kind of in a moment, this is a little bit tired, let's focus on the legs, but don't use it as an excuse to not train some of those bilateral lifts really heavy as well. So that's kind of the safety or axial loading perspective. From a functional perspective, I don't think that there's a lot of good evidence for it in terms of it being superior. When we look at, like vertical jump performance, sprint performance, a lot of athletic measures from and how they change from doing bilateral versus unilateral versus combination programs, we tend to see a very small result in favor of combination programs. We don't see that unilateral training is superior for athletic performance. We don't see that it's inferior. Doing a blend of both is probably a good idea. And I think that has less to do with the functional nature of unilateral training and more to do with the fact that if you use a blend of unilateral and bilateral training, you can train harder. If I'm only going to do squats and deadlifts, there's only so much volume of that I can do before I'm worn out. And same thing, if I'm only doing single leg movements, there's only so much that I can do before I'm worn out. By combining those two together, I think I can just train more and train harder overall and get more quality training in. So I think that's the main reason that combination training is a good idea. But I do see a lot of value in unilateral work for training some muscles and positions that might be kind of tough to hit, or gaps in a traditional bilateral only program. for example, moving in the frontal plane, kind of getting your pelvis to shift over your stance leg a little more load on the abductors, glute med, that sort of thing with like a single leg deadlift or lunge. I think if you're not doing single leg work at all, you're missing some opportunities to load some of those tissues. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's just categorically more functional. It's just different. And I think having that variety is super.
The blend of rep ranges and intensities, the blend of similar exercises, bilateral, unilateral. This is the same principle that I keep hearing just universally. And I'm really glad that you highlighted that. And just the ability to just still work the similar movement patterns, similar muscles, but you're not beating down the exact same joints, tendons from the angle of force perspective and loading. So you're getting the benefits, but you're just promoting that longevity as well and just being more comprehensive at large.
Yeah. Like I think of, I'll do Romanian deadlifts and I'll do a single leg, like landmine Romanian deadlifts, two hinge patterns I have in my program right now. And they're certainly very similar. They look very similar at first glance. But when you actually do them and you think, what do I feel? It's not quite the same. You can tell that you're overlapping a lot, but it's just
you're biasing a certain area more so.
Yeah, and it's like I feel like I can push both of those movements. I'll have one day where I push regular RDLs really hard, and I can come back 3-4 days later and push the landmine version really hard as well. If I tried to come back in and push the same exact variation again, I don't think I could bring the same level of intensity at that frequency, but changing it up just that little bit, I think is just different enough. It's like, okay, I can go hard on this again.
Nailed it. And just another question to give us some answers for this. With unilateral training, I've noticed you can do them unsupported with a balance component or having support with the other leg behind you, more stability biased. When would you choose one over the other?
Question. Couple of things to consider with it. One, there's the obvious point, which is just the stability itself. We want an exercise to be stable enough to get a good result from it. If you're focused on your balance and falling all over the place, you're probably not going to be able to lift enough load to get a good result. But I don't think that more stability is always better. I think we just have to reach a point where the stability is sufficient. I don't think that, tying yourself down with 10 different straps and like being in a machine, whatever is necessary to maximize.
Cyborg form all day.
Exactly. I don't think you have to be that extreme with it. I think you just have to get stable enough and or proficient. So I think of most beginners when they do single leg unsupported deadlift, just like a barbell in their hand, single leg deadlift, that's it. Most people are not going to have great balance with that. Right now with gait, they're going to be pretty wobbly, that kind of thing. I've practiced that movement quite a bit, and I found that, with time, I was eventually so good at that movement and so stable doing it that I could lift just as much on that as I could doing it on a Smith machine. So
Wow.
there ended up not really being that difference anymore, just in the function of skill and practice and that kind of internal stability. Whereas if you take a beginner, the different thing the two is going to be pretty drastic. So I think it's short-sighted to only think about that external stability without also considering someone's skill or proficiency with the movement and kind of how internally stable they are at movement as well.
That's a great observation.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have thought that the skill component is such a factor because people will come into these single leg RDLs and have never done it before, loaded up with a modest weight and shake all over the place. But you do that for 12 weeks, you will become proficient at the pattern.
Yeah, and people will always say, well, you'll always produce more force, in a more stable environment. They would think you could always lift more weight on the Smith machine versus the free bar. And I think that's probably true to a degree, but I think the gap can really, really start to close to the point that it's virtually insignificant or fairly insignificant. So take the person's skill level into account. Generally with a beginner, someone who's newer to the pattern, I'm going to prioritize stability a lot more. So if I'm teaching someone who's newer to the single leg deadlift overall, I'm probably going to put them on a landmine or a Smith machine or a hand supported variation, something that's very, very stable. Once they're really good at it, I might be more keen to explore some of the less supported variations. And people might be wondering, okay, what's the advantage to going unsupported then? If it's just potentially not inferior, what's the benefit to actually doing unsupported in the first place? Couple reasons that I like it. One, just accessibility. You don't always have a machine available. So knowing that if you have to, you can do a simple approach. And if you get good at it, you can utilize some of these fairly simple exercises without having to grab a dowel or a machine or all these sorts of things. It's going to be okay. But the other is it forces you to get into a very specific position to do it. So if I'm doing a unsupported single leg deadlift with the barbell, for me to be able to execute that lift, at the level that I do and close enough to, like, say, my Smith machine variation, to execute it that well, I have to shift my hips over my stance leg. I kind of have to have my pelvis centered over my stance leg. I have to keep my hips fairly level. I essentially have to get into a very specific position. Whereas if I then go and do that lift on the Smith machine, I can wiggle with all sorts of positions. I can contort my pelvis however I want. I could stand slightly sideways if I want, which is all potentially fine. But I think some of these unsupported variations force you to get into a very specific and fairly athletic position that I think targets some tissues that are really important that you can potentially bypass or work around if you're doing a machine variation. So I think it's a matter of forcing yourself to bias certain positions to really do some of these unsupported variations really, really well. And what I find is there's kind of a cyclical feedback loop, if you will, where if I get a lot stronger on supported variation, like a Smith machine or a landmine, and then I go back to something unsupported, I feel much stronger because I've gained a lot of strength. But then it happens again where I get better at the unsupported variation and I go back to something supported and it's like, oh, wow, this is easy. And it just keeps going back and forth. So I think once you get good enough for the unsupported variations to, also be fairly heavy, I think they support each other really well, just by, being close variations where you're in slightly different positions, but still same movement pattern, that sort of thing.
Great. Love it. Variation with benefits, and it's not just some random gimmick exercise. It's overall like for like movement pattern, and the transferability gives you exercise options. Okay, cool. This episode is sponsored by Fitness FAQs. Become a bodyweight beast with our calisthenics workouts. Use the coupon code podcast10 at checkout to save 10% off when shopping at fitnessfaqs.com. Don't miss this discount. Start training smarter and enjoy the gains. The optimal exercise dilemma is when we make an exercise better, we also make it worse. What is being ignored when people chase optimal exercises?
Like our last question, with an exercise not needing to be always more stable, but just stable enough. I think we see this kind of time and time again with a lot of, exercise variables. Even RPE, for example, we know that you don't have to give 10 out of 10 effort, to get good results or even maximal results. Sometimes just RPE 7 or 8, 7 or 8 out of 10 effort might be sufficient to maximize gains. I would argue that maybe a 7 or 8 out of 10 stability for an exercise is sufficient to maximize gains. I don't think we necessarily have to take every element of an exercise to 10 out of 10 for it to be a 10 out of 10 exercise, if that makes sense. So at the end of the day, we probably want to add up a couple of these things and hit some sort of arbitrary score. Let's say, take a stability value plus a RPE value plus range of motion value, add them all together. Maybe you want to get so many points. Maybe an exercise isn't very stable, but if you approach it with, great range of motion, great consistent technique, very high effort, it might still be a 10 out of 10 exercise. Likewise, an exercise could be extremely stable, great technique, could hit everything really, really well. And then maybe you give it a 7 out of 10. Overall, that's still a 10 out of 10 in terms of a stimulus. If you take any of those values too low, then you start detracting from the quality of the stimulus. But I don't think that all of them, or any of them for that matter, have to be a 10 out of 10 for it to be an effective exercise.
Another eye-opening example that I see as well is the amount of weight lifted. There's an inverse relationship between the amount of weight and the rep speed. So you can go more moderate loading and you can get those really slow eccentrics, pause, up full range of motion. That's possible with a lighter load. You take the weight up considerably, you can't manage that same rep speed. So the thing is, there's a consequence to either side of the variable. You make an exercise optimal, you can't lift as much weight. You make it more performance-based, use a stretch reflex, you can lift more weight.
And when we think of all these variables that people might optimize for, like stability or range of motion or tempo or something like that, it's impossible to drag all of those up at once. I don't know. You've probably seen
that. That was a great point you raised.
The meme on the internet where you try to turn on all the switches, and like when you turn on one, another one turns off, and it's like you can't turn them all on at the same time. And I feel like that's what it's like when you're exercising. Like I want this, I want this, I want this, and then another. All of a sudden, something's been sacrificed, and I think it's just impractical to optimize everything. And I think a lot of times when we try to do that, some people might be thinking, "Well, what's the harm trying?" It comes back to limited time, energy, executive attention, and also exercise variety. So when you think of, okay, I'm going to do a hack squat, for example, and I'm going to optimize everything about the hack squat. Say you optimize the tempo, you optimize the range of motion, you optimize the foot placement, you optimize the resistance profile. Now you have this one exercise and you're like, okay, this is how to hack squat. Okay, so you do that for 12 weeks. Now what are you going to do? Are you willing to change anything about the hack squat for the sake of variation? And then what are you sacrificing? Are you willing to try a reverse banded hack squat? No, it's not an optimal resistance profile. Well, I think it's going to be okay. Just try this other variation for a few weeks. It's going to mix it up, going to allow you to focus on something else. It's going to optimize a different part of squat. I think we think that we can optimize an exercise. We're really only optimizing an element or some select elements of that exercise. So I think being willing to realize that there is no such thing as truly optimal, just so that we have more options available to us. Because if we accept that optimal is possible, then we essentially limit our potential exercise selection a lot more. And I don't think that's very helpful for most people.
What I've learned about optimal versus more of a happy medium is that effort and relative intensity to failure, if you're ticking that box, no matter how you're optimizing whatever it is, you'll be fine at large. I think that getting lost in the details and missing that major principle of effort for what you're trying to achieve, that's the biggest difference that I see from people that are achieving great results versus those that aren't, regardless of what camp they're in.
I think one of the benefits of potentially optimizing some exercises, and I think the argument that a lot of people make, is that when you do an exercise that's not optimal, so like let's say I'm just doing a standing barbell curl, some people would say that's not an optimal exercise. True muscle isolation is very difficult. If you're doing a standing barbell curl, your glutes, hamstrings, back, your posterior chain is actually working pretty hard just to not fall over forward while doing a barbell curl. So maybe they're not getting like great growth stimulus, but those muscles are at least doing something. And some people would argue that the cumulative effect of, what your back is doing during a barbell curl, what your calves are doing during a unsupported barbell squat, the cumulative effect of all of this work that's not a true stimulus, is going to make you unnecessarily tired, unnecessarily fatigued. So basically, they want to try to minimize the contribution or minimize the fatigue, unless you're actually truly working the thing to fatigue or failure or whatever. And I think in the context of someone who is training at the absolute limits of their recovery, a professional bodybuilder, for example, who's training 2, 3, 4 hours a day, trying to save as much energy as possible, maybe that helps them a little bit. For most people, the energy they save by, doing a single arm cable preacher curl versus just standing and doing it with the bar, I just don't think it really matters. And I'd rather give them a couple of different options they can cycle between and have some fun with it.
It's fun to talk about. It's fun to geek out about. But when you're day-to-day training, try not to stress too much about it, because it's the same thing as people not getting their optimal nutrition or whatever. Comes back to what you said about sleep. Stressing too much about the finer details of each exercise might be causing you more fatigue than just chilling out and doing the exercise that you want to do.
Exactly. And I think that, a lot of times in this optimal, not optimal debate, I think that people look at it as too much of a black and white thing, and they'll say like, oh, so you don't think exercise selection matters, or oh, so you don't think that tempo matters, or you don't think anything matters. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I think a lot of these variables are important, other things you should think about. I just think that you shouldn't obsess over them more than necessary. And when you ask the question of how much is necessary, how much should I care about this variable or that variable, there's no clear answer, unfortunately.
No,
I
no.
can't tell you. It's kind of everyone's individual journey to figure out and go down that path. And I think part of the process is inevitably probably caring a little bit too much. I think sometimes you have to go there and then step back and realize, oh, that didn't matter as much as I thought it did. So I don't ever want someone that is in the process of maybe overthinking it. I don't want them to feel dumb or like we're talking down to them or anything like that. I think that everyone has to go through this evolution of making fitness more complicated than it needs to be, and figuring out how to simplify it for themselves. And hopefully listening to a conversation like this just kind of expedites that process or gets them to start thinking about why they're doing certain things, and maybe help them get to a more simplified approach sooner rather than later.
How about the idea of anti-fragility? Can you speak about movement optimism?
Absolutely. In fact, I got my, I don't know if you can see my tank top here, my Anti-Fragile Lifting Club. It's a topic very near and dear to my heart. A couple different words for it, people describing movement in different ways depending on who you ask. But movement optimism, or this kind of anti-fragile movement, or focusing on the robustness of the human body, I think it's essentially just a rejection of people who are fear mongers, so obsessed with technique, so afraid of injury. They kind of like go out with a PVC pipe until your form is perfect before adding any load. Terrified if they see someone's back round a little bit, even at home picking up a sock, they try not to round their back.
Some knee valgus.
A little knee valgus, all these sorts of things that people have become afraid of, for really no good reason. And, it's important to me because I was once one of these people, and I totally understand, what they think and why they think that. As a young person, 12, 13, 14 years old on the internet back in, early 2000s, trying to learn about fitness, you read, this is going to kill your gains, this is going to break your back, you're going to have a knee replacement. Everyone is just trying to sell you on their movement philosophy, but they do so with fear. And sometimes it's well-intended. I think sometimes it's just deceptive in nature. But no matter where you look, you're always going to find people saying, bulletproof your knees with this, fix your back pain with this. And the reality is that it's very, very poor, if any, evidence to support most of these claims. They're just things that people make up to sell you a program. And there's nothing wrong with trying to sell a program. I sell programs. I'm sure you sell programs too. But I think you can do it in a way that empowers people. I think that you can sell workout programs in a way that doesn't make people more afraid of movement than they need to be. So I think a lot of it's very disingenuous, very dishonest, and very harmful on a population level. Because now we have a lot of people walking around out there who they don't even work out. They don't even go to the gym, and they're afraid of rounding their back or letting their knee cave in. And now they're not even loading anything. People get so afraid of movement, and it becomes another barrier to exercise. They don't want to go to the gym because they don't know how to lift correctly. They're worried about their technique, and they're worried they're going to get hurt because of these things they read on the internet. So I think that some people can look at some of this stuff and kind of interpret it in a way that's not so harmful. They have enough experience under their belt to know how to train well despite some of these messages. But I think to the average person who's just kind of at home scrolling through Instagram, hasn't worked out that week, they see something about hurting your back doing whatever exercise, and they're like, I don't want to go to the gym now. So I think the more we can get the message out there that, it's okay to do some of these things and that your body is inherently robust and adaptable, as long as you find the appropriate starting. So fitness and a good workout program is not so much about having perfect technique or knowing exactly what to do. It's about just doing something and picking an appropriate starting point in terms of what's tolerable for you today. So if you go to the gym and do a couple of sets of an exercise, if it's your first day there, I hardly care about what your technique looked like. I just care that you did an appropriate load and volume for your current strength and you left feeling pretty good, and that we can build on that over. And that's really, really what movement optimism is all about. It's not about trying to get people to do Jefferson curls. They can if they want to. But it's really about just meeting people where they're at and saying, I don't care what your posture is right now. I don't care that you don't know how to do this exercise correctly. I just want to get some weight in your hands. I want to get you moving. I want to get you strengthening some of these muscles, and we'll get that technique dialed in for better performance over time. But don't be afraid of what's going to happen to you if you don't do everything perfectly. I'd rather you be afraid of what's going to happen if you keep not exercising and if you keep being afraid. So that to me is what movement optimism is really.
You dropped the mic with that last line. That was fantastic. And from my experience as a physiotherapist, seeing the difference in outcomes with people that have a positive internal locus of control, I can make change, I can be patient with my injury or pain, and I can progress, versus people that take a just negative, nocebo, that movements are going to cause them harm. The outcome of progress is just night and day. The negative self-talk, people tend to really delay their rehab progress compared to the ones that understand the situation and can move forward with some resilience and robustness, or the potential to do that with their body. And this comes back once again to, it's just easier to tell someone your pain is caused by your poor posture. It's bad to move like this. It's much harder to sell to people, you need to build up your squat. You need to build up your deadlift in a way that doesn't cause you pain, using a range of motion that you can tolerate, using an amount of weight that you can actually do without causing too much discomfort. And at large, just having a positive frame of mind for what you can achieve with your body. There is not much downside to that, short of being delusional that you can do these crazy things that your body can't do. Having that optimism is one of the guarantees of successful outcomes. Because with the physio research and pain, there's no consensus on this is actually bad, or this movement causes you pain. So what's the opposite of that? Okay, I'm going to squat with an environment, or do a movement in an environment that I can actually do, and then just go with that over time. We've really got to sell that to people.
I think a cool thing that happens in the gym is that kind of mindset around what happens when you potentially do get hurt. Because I think that whether you go to the gym or not, everyone's going to experience some sort of minor injury at some
Most
point.
definitely.
You stub your toe, you sprain something, picking up something at home, you tweak your back on a squat or a deadlift. Like, regardless of what environment you're in, some of these little minor injuries are bound to happen. And it doesn't mean that the gym is dangerous. It just means that you're a human being and things happen. But I think if you get someone in the gym, especially if you get them in the gym, on the younger side, if you're someone in their 20s and you tweak something in the gym, you can develop a very positive relationship with that experience and realize it wasn't a big deal. I got better. I came back. I got stronger. And I think that sets you up for success later in life when some of these aches and pains maybe become a little bit more inevitable and you tweak your back when you're in your mid-50s. You don't have that experience of, it's not the end of the world. I've experienced this. I've come back. I've gotten stronger. It's just a fleeting experience and it's part of my normal human experience. Where I think for a lot of people, especially if they start lifting when they're older, maybe they tweak their back for the first time in the gym, and that's something that you'll find in like 2 days, but they catastrophize it and they freak out because they've never experienced anything like that before. It's like, no, it's okay. And they have this worry, and then you start talking to them, you're like, have you ever tweaked your back or done anything like this? And most people have actually experienced something similar, maybe at home or playing a sport or something like that, but because they did it at the gym with a weight in their hand, they just freak out. So I think that cultivating that experience with pain and injury earlier on and realizing that it's just part of the experience. Some little things, some little aches and pains here and there are part of the process. And pain is just part of the human experience. It's not an emergency all the time if it's subtle. Obviously, significant injuries can happen. You can have major setbacks, but the type of thing that most people are going to experience doesn't have to be a big deal unless we make it a big deal.
I'd love to go into a few hybrid training myths that I've heard online, and I'm sure you get these questions all the time, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
So cardio kills gains because of the interference effect. True or false?
I have a feeling, I don't know what the rest of these questions are, but I have a feeling that it's going to be an it depends or mostly true or mostly false for a lot of these. So cardio kills gains because of the interference effect. I'm going to say mostly false. The shred of truth is that training interferes with training. There's only so much stress the body can take. I would even go so far as to say that squatting interferes with deadlifting. But people don't think of that as the interference effect. It's just they view it as limited training resources and time. You put all of your energy into squatting, you're not going to deadlift as well, and vice versa. But they don't call that the interference effect. It's just kind of balancing your program. So I would say the same thing applies with strength and conditioning. If you put all your eggs in one basket, obviously the other one's going to suffer. But I think you can push both really, really far, and they only start to truly interfere with each other at a really high.
I've heard that an elevated heart rate from just strength training is enough cardio.
Couple kind of tongue-in-cheek responses I have to that. One, if a big set of squats feels like cardio to you, that's not a flex. It means you need cardio. Because
that's what I needed, man. As I said, those high rep split squats, humbling.
But the underlying physiology of it, there's something called occlusion. So when your muscles tense, when your muscles contract, blood can't flow through them very well. So especially in like a full body exercise, especially like a lot of core bracing, when you're doing a heavy set of squats, blood is not flowing very well, and you actually occlude what's called venous return. So you're not getting good blood flow into the heart itself when your whole body's under a lot of tension. Now, your heart, it obviously wants to keep you alive. It wants to keep pumping blood out to the rest of your system. So when that venous return is cut off and you're not getting blood flowing into the heart, it tries to compensate for that and still tries to get a bunch of blood out. So it starts beating really, really fast to try to maintain that total cardiac output. But blood isn't getting in to be pumped out. So that heart rate response is really a compensation for poor blood flow. Unlike when doing traditional cardio, when your heart rate goes up, it's because you're pumping out more blood. Your cardiac output is elevated. When you're doing strength training, a lot of that cardiovascular response is actually a compensation for reduced blood flow, not the cause of more blood flow. When we look at total cardiac output, which is that stroke volume, so total amount of blood times heart rate is cardiac output. When we look at cardiac output during aerobic activity, it can be up to 7-fold essentially resting value. So you can see like a 700% increase in cardiac output. Typically during strength training, we'll see a slight increase, more like a 50 to 100% increase. So a modest elevation, sure, but not on the same scale as aerobic activity. The majority of that heart rate response is more of that compensation for occlusion.
Another answer that I heard you say on social media is just being a bit anxious before a strength training set can make you anxious. If you're a little bit nervous, it can also elevate heart rate. So you can't conflate that with the cardiorespiratory gains if you're just looking at heart rate calculation for cardio.
Oh, absolutely. I was at the starting line of a running race this past weekend, and you're just kind of standing there, like maybe jumping up and down a little bit, but just trying to get focused and ready to start. And my heart rate's already in my zone 2, and I'm just standing around the starting line. So it's crazy what your brain can do, that psychological stress or arousal. And you certainly have that if you're sleeping your workout, going to the gym, getting ready for a heavy squat. That heart rate is probably really high. So we do have to be careful about only paying attention to heart rate and an environment where it's a reliable proxy for cardiac output, not in other environments like if you're full of breath, if you have occlusion, if you have significant psychological stress, those sorts of things. I actually saw there's a cool paper that looked at metabolic demand. So they're actually using a mask to measure metabolic demand, measuring heart rate data, and they looked at actual fighting. So people fighting in a ring, versus just fighting exercises. And they found that heart rate was much, much higher during actual fighting than during fighting exercises for the same metabolic. So just the stress of actually being in a ring and having someone that's actually going to punch you and hurt you, that caused a significant heart rate increase compared to just hitting a bag, even though they were able to equate the actual metabolic demand.
Or even just standing up and doing some public speaking, you'll get into that zone too. So if you want to get the cardio effects, just get up and do public speaking, if that was true. Now, hypertrophy is said to make people bigger, slower, and less athletic. Thoughts?
I would say that the way that you feel and the things that you can do for most people has more to do with the training you're not doing than the training that you are doing. So if you feel slow and unathletic, it's probably because you're not doing any training that makes you fast enough. It's not because it's not because the bodybuilding training made you slow. It's not because bodybuilders can't be athletic, but what are you doing to actually develop those qualities? And I think a lot of people, especially once they're, turn 30, they stop doing anything athletic. They stop sprinting, they stop jumping, they stop doing all those things. And, they hit the gym, they do traditional strength training, and then they'll blame that for, their lack of athleticism. And it's really just all the things that they stop doing.
The same can be true for mobility as well, which is definitely something on average people tend to lose over time because they're not using full range of motion exercises. They're not gaining strength at that end range of motion. Perhaps they're not doing any traditional static stretching under load at that end range. And that goes the same as well because we see big muscular people who are adults and are also flexible, and that can absolutely blow people's minds if they don't understand about specific training.
I've heard people say that running makes you tight a lot. I hear that quite a bit. It's like, if you only run, running can be pretty time consuming. So I think a lot of times runners are really bad about just not doing anything else. And if you run and don't do anything else, that will make you tight.
Same can be said for cyclist demographic as well. They're stuck in that hip flexion, kyphosis, and you combine that with a desk job. There's not much room for expansion, which is quote unquote functional for their task, but no movement variability, so to speak.
Exactly.
How about high reps are best for endurance training?
This one's really fascinating. I'll caveat it and say that there's a few exceptions and reasons that I'm not 100% confident in my answer. But for the most part, what I would say is that if you're an endurance athlete, you're already doing a ton of energy system work, metabolic work. The gym is there to facilitate structural change in your tissues, improve rate of force production, neural drive, increase tendon stiffness, those sorts of things. And those sorts of adaptations are best achieved with high intensity. You don't need to go to the gym and do another aerobic workout. You already have a bunch of aerobic workouts. The gym is there to facilitate the adaptations that you don't get from your primary sport. So for an endurance athlete, the gym is more about filling gaps than adding redundancies. I think that most endurance athletes feel much more confident and they have a natural kind of predisposition to overperform in some of those higher up ranges. I know when I was new to the gym as a runner, I could go in and, out squat a lot of the really strong guys for a set of 30 on back squat, but my 1 rep max is terrible. And so it feels good to go in the gym and do well and be impressive in those higher up ranges, but you're probably better off working on some of your gaps and some of your weaknesses.
This comes back to what you were saying before about specificity. If you look at it really crudely, I want to do endurance, but I also want to do weights. My endurance is long duration, low intensity. I should do the same with my weights. And we understand that doesn't transfer as specifically, exactly as you said, with the unilateral and bilateral. Oh, I'm doing running and I'm spending time on a single leg propelling myself. Should unilateral training be more beneficial? Same thing could be said.
Exactly. I think that the specificity principle is one of the simplest principles in fitness, very fundamental, but also very poorly understood and misapplied. And the more specificity is not always better. We always have to think about what's the fundamental adaptation we're trying to achieve And all else being equal, if we can still achieve the same fundamental adaptation, then we can start talking about specificity and skill. But we have to cover the big rocks or the basics first.
Core training tends to be hotly debated online. You get camps that go, no core training is necessary, just do your compound lifts, or people that go heavy into core training. Where do you see the stance of most people should approach core training and the benefits to gain?
Sure. I think that any sort of high-level athlete, we were just talking about specificity. I think that it's possible to skip a lot of things and still perform really. I think there's a lot of great runners who don't even strength train at all. And would I recommend it? No, I still recommend that people will strength train, but I think it's possible to be a great runner without even lifting weights. Likewise, I think you can be a fantastic lifter and never do an ab exercise. I think that's certainly possible. But in the interest of being well-rounded, I think if you want to take a balanced approach to physique development, athletic development, those sorts of things, then I think that it's worth including. But you can certainly be a specialist in a variety of sports and not do some of those things. The main debate, the way I see it, kind of comes down to core stability exercises and so-called functional core exercises versus just treating it like any other muscle group and loading it heavy through a full range of motion. And so I think the debate essentially comes down to, is full range of motion, heavy core training, is that safe for the spine? I think that's kind of at the heart of the debate. And it's a challenging debate with a lot of nuance involved. I think that a few problems with the kind of core stability endurance camp, people who are afraid of loaded flexion, extension, rotation, those sorts of things, is they point to limited evidence for adaptability of the human spinal disc. I think the problem with a lot of that is, on the one hand, a lot of the research is done on cadavers and or pig spines, which we know is not necessarily translatable to live human tissue. The other, and I think lesser appreciated point, is that it assumes that the discs need to be able to adapt for those movements to be safe. Even if the discs don't adapt, when we look at the shear forces, compressive forces, etc., on the spine during fairly neutral spine activities, those forces are still there. If you're doing a deadlift with a neutral spine, there's still shear force. If you're doing a GHD plank versus a GHD sit-up, there's still shear force. So I think the idea that adding movement inherently amps up some of these really scary sounding forces like shear and compression, I think that's an oversimplification. So I can certainly see some reason to maybe not 1 rep max full in range flexion. I think that level of nuance is acceptable. But when it comes to training through a relatively large range of motion at fairly challenging loads, I just don't see any compelling evidence not to do those things. So in the absence of reasons not to, the idea behind movement optimism is to just load it. We don't have a reason not to do this thing. Maybe there's a little bit of caution at the very, very extremes. But I think that most people who focus only on like that, just pure neutral, no movement, isometric only, I think they're missing out on so much benefit and a lot of those things, but there's just no valid reason or current evidence to support either of those things. So
considering that your compound exercises are keeping the spine relatively, it's keeping that core relatively stiff throughout the range. There's no movement in those exercises. You can see the reason they're doing that is to have the transfer to the movement. I'm doing a plank to keep my ribs down, core tight, but I can see the merit in the full range of motion ab exercises through flexion, side flexion, even rotation stuff, is the ability to plug the missing pieces that aren't overloaded with traditional exercise.
I think that there's a couple reasons I think having some more dynamic work is important. One, a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, all else being equal. And we already get a lot of that isometric bracing stimulus from our heavy compounds. So the way I see it, if you are someone, for example, who is afraid of rounding your back on a deadlift. Let's say rounding your back on a deadlift is dangerous for sake of argument. Then wouldn't it be great if we had bigger, stronger core muscles that could better resist that movement and brace even more effectively? If we can do that with an exercise like a GHD sit-up, which doesn't have the same axial loading as a deadlift, we're doing it in what some might consider a risk mitigated environment with less compressive interior forces, just the horizontal nature of the exercise, that sort of thing. If we can get bigger, stronger muscles with an exercise like that, if that could then transfer to a more stable spine, that force production transfers to a more stable spine during a squat or a deadlift, then I think it actually makes sense, whether you're afraid of spinal flexion or not, to embrace a little bit of it to facilitate some of those strength gains. Second, we often think of squats and deadlifts. We think of those as more isometric. We think of those as exercises where the spine isn't moving and our core is bracing around them to be perfectly still. We often see people doing like the bird dog exercise where the goal is to, not move anything at all. But that's just not how those movements are actually executed in practice. Try as hard as you want to not move your spine during a deadlift. It still moves. It may not move a ton, but it is going to move a little bit.
The breath in at the top when you're going to get the Valsalva maneuver, the butt wink at the bottom if you're getting towards that end range lumbar position. It happens in reality.
Exactly. So I think if we're trying to make our core work, true isometric, not that isometric training isn't good. I think there's value in heavy, hard isometrics for a variety of reasons, and that extends beyond core training. You can do a leg extension isometric if you want. But I think tackling some of our core exercises with the misguided notion that a squat or deadlift is purely an isometric core exercise, I think there's a disconnect there.
And from just a fatigue perspective, if your core is stronger through doing full range of motion ab exercises, you do not have to brace as hard on your squats and deadlifts by virtue of your core being stronger. So that can be a consideration as well.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of why you look at a CrossFitter, for example, they tend to be really great at higher rep ranges. If you ask a CrossFitter to do a set of one on the back squat, they'll do pretty well compared to, say, a powerlifter. Some of that you could argue is the aerobic capacity. Some of it, I think, is, when you have a lot of gymnastics movements, GHD sit-ups, toes to bar, et cetera, as competition lifts. CrossFitters often have really thick, powerful midsections, some of the best abs in the business. And I think that allows them to brace and stabilize in a much more efficient manner. And I think that allows them to get in more breath. It facilitates more efficient movement at some of those rep ranges. And I think that's a undervalued component of some of that high rep performance, is the ability to actually keep bracing to a minimum and maximize that gas exchange and blood flow.
Alec, that was a fantastic conversation, mate. I really appreciate your time. If people want to follow you, where can they find out more about your work?
Thank you for having me. To find out more about me, just go to my Instagram at Alec Blennes. I post content there most days. I also do a weekly Q&A, one of my favorite parts of the week, question and answer. Keep an eye on that. If you have any questions for me, just pop something into that box.
Awesome. Train hard. Take care.
Daniel.
If you enjoyed the conversation, leave a rating on the Fitness FAQs podcast to support the show. See you next episode.